It's the Metro on WDET. I'm Robin Vincent. There are weeks when the news feels like weather, something that happens over there, something you brace for and then move through. And then there are times when it lands in your body. In the last few weeks, vigils have spread across the country after the killing of Renee Good by a federal immigration officer. People are mourning, but they're also organizing, and not just with signs and speeches. Some are choosing disruption. Some are choosing civil disobedience. They're asking a blunt question. If systems can take a life in broad daylight and then argue about vocabulary, what exactly are we supposed to do with our grief? Detroiters know what it means to be extracted from, written off, and to still survive. And that makes these stories feel like different chapters of the same book. A book about power and whose lives it's allowed to break. To help us read that book clearly, I spoke with Saqib Badi of the Action Center on Race and the Economy. His work traces the money behind public pain, and it asks what happens when communities confront the brokers that he believes are behind that pain. So, Saqib, introduce your work as if you're talking to someone at a bus stop. What does the Action Center on Race and the Economy actually do, and how is it different from a traditional policy group?
We work with community organizations and labor unions that are working at the state and local levels all across the country. And we work with them to develop campaigns to take on the corporations that are driving racial and economic harm in our communities.
Give me a few examples, just very quickly, of who you think some of the biggest offenders are and why.
Palantir is one of the companies that is profiting the most from the drive towards fascism, because Palantir's business is data harvesting for evil, is how I like to think about it. And Palantir founder Peter Thiel is actually J.D. Vance's mentor.
What is Palantir?
So Palantir is a company that does data mining for evil. They have government
for evil.
For evil. Data mining for evil.
Name the evil, please.
They have contracts with ICE, for example, to help ICE track down immigrants using all of our data. They have contracts with the Israeli military to use Palestinians' data to decide which buildings to bomb. They have lots of government contracts, and the key thing they do is figure out how to profit from using our data and selling it to the military police industrial complex.
Okay, so this is an example of one company that your group is trying to organize against. And what does that organizing look like?
By organizing against Palantir, it means we need to actually launch a campaign on a few different fronts. On the one hand, we need to have protests at Palantir offices. We know that a few groups in California, like the United Teachers of LA, the Alliance of Californians for Community Empowerment, they did an action at Palantir offices last summer during the ICE surge in LA. We know that we need to see more actions at Palantir. Secondly, it means really pushing our cities and states, particularly, blue cities and blue states, where we have folks that are, thumping their chest about, oh, we're anti-Trump. Okay, put your money where your mouth is. Cancel your contract with Palantir.
How many, do you know offhand, how many roughly cities and states have contracts with Palantir? How vast is their network?
I don't have a number, but it is very vast and growing, right? It's not just cities and states, it's school districts, it's water agencies. Palantir sells the idea that if you use their products, that makes your work more efficient. And so what that means is that a lot of folks all around the country, agencies big and small, have contracts with ICE, with Palantir.
So it sounds to me like part of your work, though, is just getting the word out about some of these companies that you see to be, as in your words, contracting with evil. I want to zoom in, if we could. We've begun by more of the 10,000 foot view. I want to think about the fact that you argue that racial injustice is built into the economy, not added on top of it. And I'm coming to you from Detroit. If Detroit is the classroom, what is the lesson? Where do you see race shaping who gets protected, who gets extracted from, and who gets blamed?
So I did a lot of work in Detroit organizing against the bankruptcy. And it was very interesting to see how the discourse around that shaped up. Because, of course, in Detroit, what we saw was that there was white flight after the first Black mayor was elected.
Coleman A. Young.
Yeah, when Coleman Young was elected. And we saw a huge shrinkage in the tax base of the city, even though the suburbs and the metro region is still one of the wealthiest in the country. And then what we saw was that because there wasn't enough tax revenue coming in, Detroit was forced to go deeper and deeper into debt. Banks, the same banks that sold Detroit homeowners predatory mortgages, they also redlined the entire city and sold the city of Detroit expensive predatory debt deals. And then we saw after Rick Snyder was elected governor that there was a series of laws that were passed at the state level that were intended to force Detroit into bankruptcy, because because ultimately the bankruptcy was a pretense to slash pensioners' money, to take control of the Detroit water and sewage system away from the city, and to seize key assets like Belle Isle.
So what you're saying here, this is an example of Detroit living through austerity politics.
Yeah.
And it is showing us historically how budget crises and tough choices have been used to restructure who a city is for and who it's not for. Is that right?
100%. During the bankruptcy, there were proposals that were being floated around by the corporate oligarchs of Detroit about essentially demolishing huge parts of the city, razing them to the ground, and creating essentially a little island in Midtown and downtown, that would be a safe haven for white commuters from the suburbs, but really leaving the communities that live, the 90% of the folks who live in Detroit who are Black, out to dry.
And this is very much a big talking point and has been a talking point in Detroit for quite some time. And it is something that politicians have latched onto, certainly in our most recent mayoral race. There was a lot of discussion about who is going to be the leader, who's going to focus on the neighborhoods and not just Midtown and downtown. And the counter to that is Detroit was in shambles. It was in the dark, and you got to start somewhere. Mayor Mike Duggan inherited a city that was in those shambles and in the dark, and he did turn on a lot of the lights, but he did focus the city's revival on the downtown, on Midtown. And you're saying you believe that was a concerted effort to make this one corridor of the city welcoming and safe for white suburbanites.
Yeah, I mean, I live in Chicago, and this is the thing Chicago, Detroit share in common, that we have a history. Our current mayor is the exception here. Mayor Brandon Johnson's amazing, but we have a history in the past of having neoliberal mayors who want to turn the city into a playground for wealthy white folks. I like to say that they want to build a city for the people they wish lived there instead of the people who actually do. What that looks like is, instead of trying to raise progressive taxation or claw back corporate subsidies from corporations that promise jobs and then leave, Instead of trying to claw that money back, we have mayors decide actually like we're going to keep divesting from working class Black and brown families. The idea that police response times were just abysmal, even in the case of homicides in Detroit, right? It would take over an hour for police to show up, even if there was a homicide. The fact that we actually had, a previous mayor of Detroit decide that they're going to stop providing city services to 20% of the city, no trash pickup, no lights, any of that, as a way to try to force people to move out of their homes and move to a different part of the city, shows what they think about the folks who actually live in the city. They think of them as an inconvenience. And so, and really to tie this back together with what's happening now, when we look at austerity budgets, we're told there's not enough money, but there's always enough money for war, for the military, for ICE, for police. These are all priorities.
I want to note that mayor was Dave Bing. He was in office from 2009 to 2013. But to be precise, the Bing administration didn't impose a flat 20% cut citywide. However, it did carry out sweeping austerity measures that reduced staffing and services across Detroit. Saqib, this reminds me of your recent writing, which argues that movements must confront billionaire power directly, not just debate policy. What does that look like in practice, especially when the billionaire class is tied to both political influence and everyday services, like what we're talking about essentially?
On the one hand, there are things like boycotts. Make it clear to these billionaires that we will not buy their products or use their companies if they're going to be part of trying to oppress us. Secondly, it's doing protests and actions, right? The fact that there were weekly protests at Tesla dealerships all across the country, it played a big role in driving down the price of Tesla stock and directly hit Elon Musk's wealth. As a result of the protests, the boycotts of Tesla, and a bunch of shareholder investor action that was happening, Elon Musk for a while actually lost his status as the richest person in the world, right? Because his wealth actually took a big hit because of the economic impact of all those campaigns. And that's a big part of why we believe he actually stepped down from the Department of Government Efficiency and stopped working with Trump because he realized the cost to his businesses was too high. Secondly, we need campaigns to divest our assets. And when I say that, I mean our pension fund money, our savings accounts, our churches and mosques, endowments, if they have them. We need to figure out what are all our university endowments, what are all the different pots of money that is supposed to be accountable to the people, that is mission driven, and how do we ensure that that money is not going towards the companies of these billionaires. And then finally, we need to make sure that our cities and states are not contracting with these companies, that they're not doing business with them. And so that means, Enterprise Rental Car, for example, is supplying the cars for ICE agents in Minneapolis and around Minnesota. So how do we push all of our businesses to actually stop doing business with Enterprise, right? So what we need to do is create an economic cost for these folks for their complicity with the administration.
You've given us some things to think about in terms of placing pressure on power. I do want to pose a harder historical question because without unity, placing pressure on power can feel a bit futile. Movements often split between respectability and disruption. Mm-hmm. What have past successful movements taught you about that tension? And what do you think people misunderstand about disorder versus democracy?
I think a lot of folks who focus on respectability think that somehow being respectable will protect them. And we know that it doesn't. We know that actually power, oppressive power, only cares about power. They don't care about respectability. They view respectability as weakness and exploit that. We know that the movements that have actually won big changes, they took big risks. They did stuff that was extremely unpopular. Martin Luther King Jr., everyone sort of tries to paint him as a quote unquote, respectable leader. When he was alive, we had the establishment, the status quo, white politicians, the federal law enforcement. They viewed him as a threat to order. They had a huge FBI file on him. We know that they were, actively going after him, and so we know what that means. What it means is that respectability politics is where movements go to die. What we need is to figure out how we're actually causing enough disruption and enough disorder to be able to, in a peaceful way, how do we cause enough disruption and enough disorder to actually force the folks that are profiting from the crises in our communities to confront those crises at their doorsteps.
Saqib Badi leads the Action Center on Race and the Economy. It's the Metro on WDET. Coming up, we'll examine how Americans feel about foreign policy amid this sharp shift. This is the Metro on WDET. Stay with us.